You're listening to the Unfixed podcast.
I would like to say that I am more at peace with the projected progression outcome of ALS, maybe a little bit, but ultimately it seems that passing by suffocation is a serious challenge to maintain a peaceful state of mind through. It is a rather violent tearing of one from the breath of life. I still have time to train in equanimity. Through my practice I aspire to grow into my spirit, such that even those strong cries of my body and survival instincts will be just leaves dropping on the ocean of my eternal self, so full of love there will be no room to fear. It has always been my life goal to reach that state, but now it is just a higher priority.
Hi everyone. This is the Unfixed podcast, and I'm your host, Martel Catalano. The chronic illness community often talks to each other, but in this show, we open the dialogue, exploring adversity through different walks of life to recognize our shared humanness. These intimate conversations are between people who are creatively contending with diverse challenges. One person has a chronic health condition, because they're often experts in facing the hard stuff. The other is a professional working within a relevant field or facing their own unique battle. Each episode is an invitation to lean into curiosity and compassion while recognizing that we can live powerful lives despite, or sometimes because of, our circumstances. This podcast is part of a suite of resources provided by Beyond My Battle. If you feel inclined to support the show, you can do so at beyondmybattle.org/donate. That quote we opened with was from Dylan Shanahan. He's a subject in the award-winning video series Unfixed. During the 5th year of a 6-year naturopathic medical degree program, Dylan's first symptoms began. He was diagnosed with ALS in April of 2018. That next fall semester, he was in a wheelchair and eventually came to school in medical transports. He was just 2 quarters away from graduation, but his breath capacity became so low that his voice was barely audible. Withdrawing from his medical studies was one of the hardest decisions of Dylan's life. A few months later, one of his professors petitioned the board of directors on his behalf, and they voted to award Dylan honorary doctorate degrees for naturopathic and Chinese medicine. He was overwhelmed with gratitude and gave a speech through his communication device at commencement, where he was able to graduate with his classmates. Dylan has always believed that as one door closes, 2 doors open. Immobile now, he has his eyes and his gaze-controlled tablet where he writes about his unique experiences through the disease process of ALS. He is a true explorer of the human spirit, seeking answers to life's most difficult questions. It is a different kind of adventure, but he maintains an openness and appreciation for the invisible guiding hand through his journey. Just as he wouldn't want to deny himself the previous experiences of his life, he doesn't condemn his new adventure with ALS. And today we're excited to hear Dylan share a conversation with another wonderful human who has devoted his life to helping patients and caregivers navigate catastrophic illnesses with mindfulness and grace. Pierre Zimmerman has been working in behavioral and elder health care for over 30 years. He was ordained as a Buddhist Chaplain from Upaya Zen Center with Roshi Joan Halifax in 2011 and studied mindfulness-based stress reduction with John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts. He has provided MBSR classes to physicians, cancer patients, patients with chronic illness, and more. Pierre also leads meditation and support groups for patients who have a catastrophic illness diagnosis, along with their caregivers. He has practiced bodywork, meditation, and yoga for decades, involving many techniques that integrate the body, mind, and spirit to reduce stress, maximize transformative health outcomes, and serve people so that they can be aware of the connection to themselves, others, and the world they inhabit. Pierre is also a stage 4 cancer survivor and is currently working on publishing his first book about how an attitude of survivorship can promote a deep understanding of life before, during, and after disease. Pierre also happens to be currently the president of the board of directors for Beyond My Battle. Together, Dylan and Pierre are here with us today to share a deeply moving conversation about approaching chronic illness with an open heart. A note to our listeners, Dylan is no longer able to use his vocal cords, so he communicates through an eye-tracking device, spelling out his sentences with his gaze. I do not want to mislead our listeners that this is a quick, easy task, so in full transparency, Dylan has prepared his responses in advance. Sometimes the technology mispronounces his text, so you may occasionally hear an unusual sounding word or two, but the few glitches here or there are certainly outweighed by Dylan's deep, reflective insights. So with that being said, let's get started. Dylan and Pierre, I am so happy and honored to introduce you to each other.
Thank you.
Hello, nice to meet you, Pierre and Martel. It is an honor to be on your podcast.
It's an honor to have you here, Dylan, and also Pierre, who I've known for years now and has had a great influence on my life. I'm going to start out with a heavy question. You both have been initiated into this idea of impermanence and what that means for your own life's journey. Pierre through your stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and Dylan through contending daily with, the progression of ALS. Now that this concept of impermanence, one that is so at the heart of Buddhist philosophy, and I'm sure the work that you had done in your medical program, Dylan, as well, now that this concept of impermanence is more of a welcomed guest than a fear, can you both reflect on what matters most to you now in life?
I've been working towards the same goals and aspirations before this journey with ALS. What changed after ALS is that it became more essential, with the other aspects of my life removed from the possibilities. I'm not going out for pizza with friends, for better or worse. This life I'm in has been stripped down to the core. It can be seen as a service to my path. As I said, I am on a path. In Chinese it is called the Doa, the way. I believe the purpose of this all is to learn how to be more loving human beings. It is simple. Through countless lives we continue this spiritual evolution that drives our physical evolution, growing closer to the ideal of love, emulating the masters, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and many more, following their guidance to advance on the path as they have. That is what is most important to me, to learn how to grow into a more loving human being. It has become clear to me that some of our deepest lessons come through hardships. Pain on all levels sharpens the attention, as one potential explanation. I would not wish on anyone what I have been through. At the same time, I have learned so much about myself through my experience that it's hard to imagine how I could have otherwise. We can all embrace our struggles because within them we can find a lotus in the mud, a lesson to light our growth. It is critical to remember to look for it, to see past the pain to the potential for the experience to help you in some way. It is a way to see the world around us. It's always trying to help us, even when it hurts. The other aspect of my journey that is of the utmost importance is being of service. As we grow in love, the natural expression will be the desire to be of service. That is why I started my website, lifebreath.net, to uplift people through my writing, to share the insights from my experiences. The long-term goals are to capitalize on the momentum achieved in my website to generate some advances to reverse climate change through reforestation in the Pacific Northwest.
Wow. Amazing. I'm so blown away by your response, Dylan. Pierre, what do you think?
So for me, really, my life evolves around to support others in reducing their suffering, fostering a mind of compassion, to let go of stickiness and fixations that get in the way of people for transformation, self-transformation, focus on living purpose and meaning, and also really on possibilities rather than problems. I'm really interested in supporting others in allowing for them to manage their life force within with ease and less resistance. And in a lot of the support groups, I create a container where people can see and open up to the mystery of life, pain and suffering and contentment. But it doesn't have to be just with people who have issues or problems or physical issues. I'm also interested in really well-being and well-flourishing with my family. I have a lot of grandchildren, as well as friends and concentric circles around me, whether with colleagues or others. So my goal is to be what we call a bodhisattva, somebody who really is interested in reducing suffering in the world in so many levels.
Yeah, which comes back to what Dylan mentioned about being of service. I completely agree that the nature of suffering, when you open up to it and you want to be coming from a place of love, like Dylan mentioned, the natural progression of that is to help other people. And it does seem that in our worst moments of suffering is where that is discovered from. So I know that you both have a couple questions prepared for each other. Dylan, it looks like yours is the first one.
In your essay, Welcoming Grace, you're right. Something great is always waiting to emerge in the space where we open up to our limitations. What is it about opening to our limitations that makes this possible?
So the way I look at it is, what we resist tends to persist. And when we know about impermanence, when we know that things change all the time, if we can open up to difficulties, challenges, it really gives us an opportunity to heal, maybe to see the glass half full instead of half empty. And so it gives us a different way of seeing what kind of relationship we have to different situations and people. And the way I define healing is really going to the places where we were maybe absent before or difficult moments. And it really helps us to find out who we are in a much wider sense. And I like to use the 5 elements to kind of explain that. So there's like the earth element, and all these elements, by the way, are in nature. They're in us, in our emotional life, in our intellectual life, and also in relationships. And so the way I see it is with the earth element gives us stability, structure, form. With the water element, we have fluidity, ease. The fire element, we have passion, intensity. And with the air element, we have movement. And finally, space. The space element is about boundlessness. There are no limitations. And when we look at these 5 elements, sometimes we have less in one than the others or more in one than the others. And if we can create some balance, that helps us in meeting really limitations and challenges. And a good example is fluidity or water. I mean, if, for instance, with surfers, they cannot keep riding the crest of the wave forever. So it's like really knowing that there are the ups and downs in life and we meet them all. And sometimes we do well with it, sometimes we don't do that well. And it often is a little bit like peeling an onion. It creates tears, but afterwards our vision is has a little more clarity.
Pierre, I love the way that you incorporate the elements into everything, and it can be such a subtle incorporation. And I think about how to talk about that with other people in conversation that don't know what you're talking about, but I don't think it needs to be communicated, right? Like there is a sense of, that fire is passion and it's excitement, and just knowing that and applying it to everything in life. You don't have to say like, oh, that's your fire element acting up. So I think that I've over the years of studying, well, specifically Ayurveda, where those elements are so the center of all the study, I've always wondered, like, how do I, apply this in real world, in real life? But it just becomes such a part of everything, and because it is a part of everything, like you said. So I love that. Pierre, you have a question for Dylan next.
Yeah, Dylan, you mentioned that you experience equanimity. And I'm curious as to how you would define it for someone maybe who doesn't understand it. Would love to hear your vision about equanimity.
I read that you have experience with SN Goenka. I do also through the videos at the Vipassana meditation retreats. That was my first exposure to the concept of equanimity. I learned that it is remaining balanced between the cravings for pleasure and repulsion of unpleasant sensations. In that balance between the poles of craving and repulsion, I have felt a deep peace. The meditation focuses on sensations of the body, and expanding the practice to one's life deals more with the mind. Of course, the dichotomy of body and mind is an illusion, but it helps to illustrate the significance of using equanimity in daily life. We are constantly labeling situations good or bad, like we do with sensations, either pleasant or unpleasant. In relation to chronic disease and terminal illness, we can't see the lessons and growth that could come through the experience. For the growth of the soul, the experience with this disease could be exactly what is needed. Don't get me wrong, I am not being fatalistic. When they told me that I was diagnosed with an uncurable terminal illness, I tried everything in hopes of finding a cure. The difference is that my relationship to the disease process didn't change. I made my peace with it while I was searching for a cure, and I have made my peace with it while I live with it and pray for a miracle. For equanimity to be effective, it is crucial to be mindful of our habitual labeling of situations and sensations. I like the saying, pain is pain, suffering is optional. That is the power of equanimity. It can unlock us from the suffering that we choose to associate with our symptoms, disease prognosis, and life circumstances. May we all feel the peace residing between craving and repulsion.
So true. When you said, that quote about pain is pain, but suffering is optional, it reminds me of that great metaphor of that I'm sure you both know, the second arrow, right? Like, we have the pain of the experience or the whatever we're negative feeling about the current experience. And then the second arrow is that like we suffer because we think about the pain of the experience, or we judge ourselves for being down about ourselves or for not being stronger. So it's that like that's an optional second arrow though, right? So I love that. And thank you for your answer. Dylan, you have a question for Pierre next.
In the first chapter of your upcoming book, you referred to the cancer cells as terrorist cells in the beginning, And then towards the end of the chapter you referred to them as rogue cells. Recognizing the drastically different levels of implied hostility intrinsic in those two words, does that suggest your relationship to the cancer cells in your body changed?
So thank you for asking that. I use them at times differently in the book, but in the introduction, I wanted people to know that they are like a terrorist. In other words, they invade our body. And then the rogue term has more like a continuous kind of quality. But let me talk about terrorist or rogue cells. They're really malignant. They're destructive intentionality and directionality. And unlike regular cells who have many qualities, like they have their own identity, specific purpose, they work for the greater good of the community of cells, for other cells' health, and they gravitate towards others. They tend to cooperate for the greater good. They don't compete. They're part of an interdependent network in which they support others in regulating each other's growth, behavior, and health. And they know when to die, which is really an evolutionary kind of altruistic built-in program. With terrorist cells, they don't have the capacity for self-definition. They're like a virus. So they create anarchy. They don't self-regulate. Therefore, they don't mature or evolve. They're not connected to reciprocal networks that might influence their growth or behavior. They divide and reproduce uncontrollably. Their function is to kill the host that has given them life. So there's really not all that much difference other than when I explain what, regular cells have, who they are, versus terrorist cells. It's really the opposite. And that gave me a lot of options for me to deal with my own cancer by looking at it that way. Because then I could understand that maybe I have some control over their intentionality, their trajectory, in order to move towards well-being. And I don't like the term survivorship. It sounds kind of boring. And so cancer with an attitude for me means that we do have some options, irregardless of what the outcome is. And what's important is during the journey is to really look at how we can have quality of life. And I think that goes for all kinds of illnesses or dis-ease. And I think, Dylan, you are the greatest example of that.
Pierre, I have a quick question. Do people ever, when they hear about your book or your mission and your lived experience with cancer, do people ever criticize you or kind of get defensive in saying, like, are you telling me that I can think my cancer away? Do people ever say that?
No, I don't say that.
I know you don't say that.
I think some people, get upset when people say I came out of it and, my life, it's actually a piece of grace. I'm grateful for having gone to this journey because my life changed drastically towards well-being and well-flourishing. And some people have issues with that, but that's okay. We have different options in terms of dealing with anything that's catastrophic. And one of it is state of mind, hopefully, that is more oriented towards well-being, regardless of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I can see people going on the defense in that situation, which is really more of a projection of their own fear, right, in that circumstance. But when you say it like that we just have options with how we think about this, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily saying you're going to heal, but it's saying that you don't have to potentially, like Dylan said, add the suffering, pile the suffering on top of the pain.
Yes.
So I'm so happy that you explained that. Thank you. So Pierre, you have a question for Dylan next.
Yes. So, Dylan, we all have this universal passport into some other realm when we drop the body. People give that transition different names. I was wondering what your relationship to it is, and does the spirit move on?
I'm convinced that it does. We are given an independent, unique, indestructible spirit that cannot be taken away by anything. The spirit exists in the non-physical and therefore is unaffected by the cessation of our physical form. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it simply transforms. Here from a spirit in the body to a spirit untethered to this world. Where do we go after that? We cannot know, but I have faith from my studies and soul searching that we return to the source. I foresee it as purest homecoming possible, where we regain a state of union that erases all self-doubt, all loneliness, and all earthly afflictions. Once again we are able to see the truth of our being. I understand it as a beautiful transformation. We all have survival instincts, but we can rise above them. That is something I think about a lot. How can I pass over not gripped by fear, but with the welcoming spirit of lovingly embracing what is to come? I will likely pass by suffocation, because my diaphragm is very weak. Many people with ALS choose to end their lives because of quality of life declines. Although the ventilator could keep us breathing for longer, other systems can become affected and it can be too much to live with. I have already made it official that if I cannot communicate to pull my ventilator, 10% of patients will develop lock eye, and without eye movement we can't use the communication device that tracks our eyes. That brings us to the moment of truth, unplugging my ventilator. It will only take a few minutes or less for me to suffocate. My doctor told me they usually give morphine to ease the sensations of suffocation. Could I come to be so rooted in equanimity that I could go through this experience without the drugs? I ask myself. I'm under the impression that morphine will ease the grip of my survival instincts on me during the moment of truth, but it will also dull my embrace of my great return. What if in the moment of reaching out to embrace the reunion with my Maker, transcending the sensations that comes with suffocating, I can experience a sense that something or someone is reaching back to me, welcoming me home. Even if it is only for a moment, to experience such a thing in waking consciousness would complete my spiritual quest in many ways. Living in that state of dual awareness of the physical and non-physical, spirit and matter, is the ultimate goal. But of course I have no problem working towards that in my next life, having already cracked the seal in this one.
Wow, I think it was Ram Dass who said we're all just walking each other home, and I couldn't help but think of that when you were talking about going home, Dylan. So that's a really it's like a tough pill to swallow, but it's so beautiful that you have come to be able to articulate it and think about it so with such a sense of openness and grace. So thank you. Dylan, I know you have your next question for Pierre.
When it comes to how a terminal diagnosis can bring up our fear of mortality, do you have a different approach for atheists and believers?
It's a great question. Simple answer is not really. Even though Buddhist chaplain, when I was working as an interfaith chaplain on an infusion unit where they treat about 2,000 people a year, one of the first weeks I walked around and I met with people, chatted while they were getting their chemo, etc. And usually didn't ask big questions. I asked, what their passion is, why they're here, how did they come here, etc. But there was one fellow that always sort of said, get away. He asked me who I was. And then he says, get away from me. Don't come close to me. And he gave the two fingers like, get away. And it was so funny. And the second week I went back to him and he said, look, I'm an atheist. I don't want any chaplains around or priests. And I said, don't worry about it. And I asked him, what is your passion? What are you reading? And so on. And we became good friends after a while. But I think, most people feel about this universal passport that we all have, like Woody Allen. And he said, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. So it's universal fear. Our culture doesn't talk about it or very little. And, it's fascinating to me to hear that even Kubler-Ross was kind of screaming and telling God, it says, you great procrastinator, take me out of here. And so even though she built this nice 5 stages of dealing with dying, she also had a hard time. So we never know how it's going to happen. And I've witnessed people who went very calmly, and I witnessed people who had a hard time. And I don't make the difference between those who have a God and those who don't have a God. I just look at it as perceived as an end or a passage to another realm.
That's a great, great question, Dylan. I think my favorite of this conversation. I think I couldn't agree more that there has to be a normalization of death and dying, and we never know what to tell children about it, right? Like that's kind of the first indicator is you don't want to scare children about something, but like what if it didn't have to be so scary? And then you'd be potentially setting the child up for a life of knowing that the most natural thing that will ever happen to them is not so scary. And I don't speak from experience with that because that certainly didn't happen to me. And I still have different fears associated with it. But I think that if we could do that at an early age, then we might, see so much change within every fabric of our life, from war to politics and caring for one another, education. Everything would really change if death and dying became less of a taboo. Pierre, you're up.
So many of us move towards enlightenment at different velocity. You seem to define it as letting go of the ego, illusions of safety. Did I understand you correctly in this regard? And could you please elaborate?
Gladly. First, it is helpful, I think, when we are talking about concepts like enlightenment, to keep in mind the line from the Book of Change, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. With that disclaimer in place, I will answer your question. Yes, you understand where I am going with this. It is a great follow-up question from your last one, because they are connected. The experience that I am longing for with my passing is essentially enlightenment. The process of letting go of the body at the time of the transition from this world to the next brings up the critical steps to experiencing enlightenment, but as you mentioned, at a much higher velocity than we deal with in our daily practice. The letting go of ego and the illusions of safety are very connected. What is the fear trying to protect in our survival instincts? It is our illusion of self, which we can call the ego. It's the false identifier that I am only my body. As I talked about earlier, the spirit is eternal, and what is eternal is the most true. The experience of the truth of who and what we are is enlightenment to me. We have to let die, if you will, our attachments to this false self. The survival instincts lead us to desire safety, this to protect our ego. It doesn't just come when we are threatened. It is a fear that is with us always. We are trying to protect it a lot in medicine. We use drugs that decrease morbidity of certain conditions, but don't attempt to cure it and commonly create other problems. I digress. This fear that is always with us, the fear of loss of self, is the main obstacle to enlightenment. Where there is fear, there can't be love. There's an alchemical process here of transforming the impure into the pure, steel into gold. We are all somewhere on this spectrum. Society has almost a mental illness with the common rejection of death and dying, because it is inevitable that we all die in our bodies. Everything dies, the sun will die someday, trees die, animals die, and even rocks die. They will transform from rocks into sand, sand into dust, dust into raindrops, raindrops into the ocean. We all return to the ocean of our being. If we are not illusions of the ego, what are we? We are a wave in the ocean of being, where we are both of the ocean and our unique expression of it, like a big spirit and small spirit. I believe when we are enlightened, this realization becomes self-evident. The prerequisite to this experience is the transformation of our identity. Terminal illness is the fast track to enlightenment if we choose to work with it in this way. The fears of the attachment to the false self will be called to the surface. It can be a great opportunity to address with your compassionate awareness to convert those fears into love for the eternal spirit. In daily life, it is very challenging to get fears of the loss of the false self to surface to this extent. Otherwise, it would take a very deep meditation practice or something similarly deep. It is up to all of us to choose how we work with the terminal illness or simply our life experiences.
That's great. I love how you connected the concept of enlightenment to that first verse of the Tao Te Ching. It's true. Like, if you can name it, then it isn't the real thing, right? If you can like name enlightenment, then you can't possibly quite know, or it's not, the name of it itself isn't the actual concept. It's very beautiful. Thank you. So Dylan, you're up.
I have been thinking about how attachment can lead to a cold distancing from the suffering of others. How can attachment be reframed to promote the opening of the heart and create more loving warmth for each other and ourselves?
So, working with clinicians, physicians, a lot of them really they burn out very quickly. And I use the word detachment a lot in the sense that we need to let go of the narratives, the storylines about the suffering of others, and just bear witness, because otherwise we cannot have pro-social behavior for people. And what's interesting is, so we can have resonance, but we don't become hijacked by the story. It's interesting that the word empathy didn't happen until about 100 years ago, from a German name called Einfühlung, which means feeling within, in other words, resonance. And, so I always ask the question, how can I serve you best? And I like Rachel Naomi Remen, who's a physician, who talks about when you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And when you serve, you see life as whole. And so when we can let go of our agendas, and that's the part that we need to detach, the willingness to help right away, then we can open up to presence. What is best way to go about serving this person who's suffering? And I call, that's the unconditional presence for me. So a lot of people have sort of objections with the word detachment, but I usually explain it in this way. I'll give you another example of I had a friend who did, NGO work, non-governmental organization in, I think it was Myanmar, where the tsunami happened. And so she was well-intentioned. She went there, and the second day after the tsunami, she saw this woman on the beach, older, indigenous woman, barely clothed, pretty much naked. And she says, "How can I help you?" And the woman turned around after a few minutes and said, "If you came here to help me, don't bother. If you came here to walk with me and share your freedom and your enlightenment or your understanding of life, then we might walk together." And so that's an interesting way of not getting, really hijacked by our emotional dysregulation sometimes when we have a hard time being with somebody who's suffering a lot.
So true. I think in the chronic illness and rare disease disability community, a lot of times the person who has the diagnosis gets very frustrated with either not receiving any help, of course, but on the flip side of that, it's like getting so much help that they feel pitied. And I hear that a lot in support groups that we run, and just in the thousands of conversations that I've had with people in this world or in this population. And I think there's something to be said there, and that story really highlights that. It's like, what if your hand outreached wasn't just to help, and oftentimes it's to fix, right? Like, we have this human nature just wants to fix and mend things, which for so many of us, our conditions are unfixable. If we could reach out that hand, to hold the hand instead of to lift the person up or to change the person or fix the person, that's really what we're looking for in so many cases. I mean, I'm an advocate for asking for people asking for help. I think that pushing help away is detrimental to our health and to our relationships, but I think we can change the way that we approach it. And I love that story, Pierre. Thank you for sharing. This is a conversation that I wish I could continue on for hours, but I want to let you both get back to your days. And Dylan, I wish that I could meet you in person if I ever make it out to the other side of the country when there is not a global pandemic. I will do my best to say hello to you. It's been great getting to know you.
Thanks so much. You're always welcome.
Dylan, I'm going to send you a big hug to your big spirit.
Listeners can learn more about Dylan and Pierre by heading to the episode page on beyondmybattle.org or unfixedfilm.com. The Unfixed podcast is a collaboration between Unfixed Media Productions and Beyond My Battle, a nonprofit helping people reduce the stress of illness and disability. If you want to learn more about the Unfixed documentary, visit unfixedmedia.com or subscribe to the Unfixed Community YouTube channel. As always, if this show or particular episode resonated with you or helped you in some way, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or share it with your friends and family. Each episode is recorded and edited by Starling Studios.